The wealthy rancher couldn't bear his loneliness, so that night he invited his Apache neighbor. The rancher had everything anyone could ever want: land stretching as far as the eye could see, cattle grazing peacefully in wide green fields, and a house that reflected his success. It was a grand home with sturdy walls, large windows that let in the sunlight, and a porch that looked over the rolling hills of his property. On paper, his life seemed perfect, but inside he felt an emptiness that money, possessions, or fame could never fill. The rancher was lonely in a way that gnawed at him quietly, a constant ache he had learned to live with but never fully accept. He would wake up early, just as the sun began to rise, and walk through the ranch to inspect the cattle, the fences, and the barns. The workers were efficient and kind, but their presence was always professional, always respectful of boundaries. Conversations were limited to the daily work at hand, orders, and updates on the animals. When he spoke, it was often about plans, schedules, or business. People respected him, but they did not know him. They did not know the thoughts that weighed on him each night, the quiet longing that made his chest feel heavy when he sat alone by the fireplace. Evenings were the hardest. After a long day of riding through the fields and checking on the ranch's operations, he would return to his house to a quiet, empty dining room. Meals were solitary affairs, eaten in silence with only the crackling fire and the occasional howl of distant coyotes as companions. Sometimes he would look out the window at the horizon and wonder if he had made a mistake in building his life so far from everyone else. There were no neighbors close by, no friends stopping in for tea, no laughter echoing through the hallways. It was just him, the ranch, and the wide open sky. He often thought about the people he had known in his youth, the friends and family who had drifted away over the years. Some had moved to cities, chasing careers and opportunities he had never sought. Others had passed on, leaving only memories that seemed both distant and painfully close. He missed the simple things most of all: sharing a story over a cup of coffee, laughing at a small joke, or even having someone simply listen as he talked about his day. The loneliness had become a shadow that followed him everywhere, sometimes so quiet that he forgot it was there, but always waiting to remind him of its presence. Despite his solitude, there was someone nearby who always caught his attention: the man who lived a few miles away, his Apache neighbor. He was different from anyone else the rancher knew. Calm, composed, and quietly confident, the neighbor had a way of carrying himself that demanded respect without needing to say much. The rancher had observed him from a distance many times, tending to his land with care, moving with precision and thoughtfulness, and always showing kindness to his family and community. There was something about him that intrigued the rancher, something that made him wonder what it would be like to know him personally. But he had never reached out before. Pride, shyness, or perhaps fear had held him back. What if the neighbor thought his invitation was unusual or awkward? What if it was rejected? These questions swirled in his mind, creating invisible barriers that kept him isolated in his own home. Yet, as another evening approached, he felt a stirring of courage he hadn't felt in years. He realized that the pain of loneliness was heavier than any fear of rejection. He needed human connection, someone to talk to, someone who might understand him beyond the surface. That night the rancher sat in his study, looking at the dim glow of the lamp on his desk. The house was quiet, the usual sounds of the ranch fading into the night. He thought about the neighbor, about the life he led, and about the possibility of an evening spent in conversation and shared stories. The idea of inviting him over seemed both terrifying and exhilarating. But the rancher knew one thing for certain: if he didn't act, the loneliness would continue to grow, a shadow that would never lift. He made a decision. Tonight he would go to the neighbor's house and extend an invitation. He prepared himself carefully. Not because he needed to impress the neighbor, but because he wanted the evening to be comfortable and welcoming. He cleaned the house, making sure the floors were swept and the fireplace was ready to provide warmth. He checked the dining table, arranging it neatly, and prepared a simple meal, nothing extravagant, just something thoughtful to share. Cooking had never been his strongest skill, but he approached it with care, stirring pots and tasting dishes, as if each bite could bridge the gap between his isolation and the friendship he hoped to find. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, he felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. He dressed carefully, choosing clothes that were neat but not formal, and took a deep breath. It was time. He mounted his horse and rode slowly toward the neighbor's property, the wind cool against his face, carrying with it the sense of the earth and the ranch. Each step, each moment, brought him closer to the unknown, but he held on to hope that this step would change everything. When he arrived, the neighbor was outside, tending to a small fire and stacking wood for the evening. The rancher dismounted, his heart racing but steady in its determination. He greeted the neighbor with a polite nod, and for a moment the two men simply observed each other, the quiet night stretching between them. Then, finding courage in the stillness, the rancher spoke. He invited the neighbor to come over for dinner, explaining simply that he valued company and wished to share an evening together. There was a pause, a moment of hesitation as the neighbor considered the offer. The rancher noticed a faint smile, a hint of curiosity in the neighbor's eyes, and he felt a spark of hope. Finally, the neighbor nodded, accepting the invitation. It was a small gesture, but it carried the promise of connection, of conversation, of human warmth. Together, they walked toward the rancher's home, the stars beginning to emerge in the night sky, silent witnesses to a friendship that had yet to begin, but was already stirring into life. That night, as they entered the house, and the fire crackled warmly, the rancher felt a sense of relief he hadn't known in years. He realized that courage was not always about bold actions in front of others. It could be found in small steps, in the willingness to open one's heart to another person. The loneliness that had weighed him down for so long seemed a little lighter, softened by the simple act of reaching out. And as they sat down together, ready to share a meal and perhaps even stories of their lives, the rancher knew that this night could mark the beginning of something meaningful, something that could bring light into the quiet spaces of his life. For the first time in a long while, he felt anticipation, not for work, not for wealth, not for recognition, but for something far more precious, the possibility of genuine friendship. The night stretched on, and though conversation had not yet begun, the presence of another human being, sitting across from him, sharing the warmth of his home, was enough to start dissolving the years of solitude. He did not yet know how deep the connection would grow or the challenges they might face, but he knew one thing clearly. He had taken the first step, and it was a step that could change everything. The fire flickered, casting soft shadows across the room, and the rancher felt a quiet peace settle over him. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the sounds of the night, while inside, a new chapter quietly began, a chapter in which loneliness could be replaced, slowly and surely, by the warmth of trust, understanding, and human connection. It was the start of a story that neither man could yet fully imagine, but both would come to cherish. And as the stars shone above, the rancher finally allowed himself to feel something he had not felt in a long time: hope. The rancher felt a mix of relief and nervousness as he led his Apache neighbor into the house. Though he had hoped for this evening, now that it had arrived, he realized how much he wanted it to go well. He had cleaned the home, arranged the table, and prepared the meal with care, but he worried quietly in the back of his mind. Would the neighbor feel comfortable here? Would he enjoy the evening, or would it be awkward and stilted? The neighbor stepped inside with calm confidence, taking in the room with quiet eyes. He noticed the fire burning in the hearth, the soft glow of the lamp on the table, and the neatly arranged chairs. There was a warmth in the room that came not just from the fire, but from the thoughtfulness that surrounded him. The rancher, feeling slightly embarrassed, gestured toward the table. "Please, sit wherever you like," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The neighbor chose a seat across from the rancher, and for a few moments they simply observed each other. Silence can be uncomfortable, but this was a silence filled with curiosity rather than tension. Each man studied the other, trying to read the thoughts behind the eyes, the feelings behind the expressions. The rancher felt his nerves begin to settle. There was no hostility, no judgment, just a quiet attentiveness that made him feel seen, even in the smallest way. The rancher poured a glass of water for his guest and then for himself. He realized how small gestures could carry meaning. The simple act of offering a drink, of preparing a place for someone at his table, was a way of saying, without words, that he valued this connection. It was strange, he thought, how such small things could feel so significant after years of solitude. As the meal began, the rancher tried to break the initial tension with light conversation. He spoke of the weather, of the cattle, of the quiet beauty of the land around them. The neighbor listened carefully, nodding occasionally, and added small details of his own, sharing experiences of tending to his own property and caring for his family. The rancher noticed a rhythm forming, a gentle back and forth that made the conversation feel natural, like two streams slowly merging into a single flow. The meal itself was simple but hearty. The rancher had prepared roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and a stew that simmered for hours, its aroma filling the room. He watched as the neighbor sampled the food, noting the careful way he appreciated each bite. The neighbor complimented the meal quietly, not with exaggerated praise, but with genuine gratitude. The rancher felt a surge of warmth. It was a small thing, but it made him feel acknowledged and appreciated in a way he had almost forgotten was possible. After the first course, the conversation began to deepen. The rancher spoke cautiously about his life, about the responsibilities of managing a large ranch, the long days filled with work, and the quiet nights that often felt too long. He did not overshare at first, but he allowed glimpses of his loneliness to surface. The neighbor listened with steady attention, never interrupting, never judging. His presence was a comfort, like a steady hand on the shoulder in a moment of uncertainty. The neighbor, in turn, began to share stories of his own life. He spoke of his family, of the values that had been passed down to him, and of the joys and challenges of living close to the land. He spoke of traditions and memories, of lessons learned from elders, and of moments of quiet pride. The rancher listened with fascination, realizing how little he truly knew about the people who lived nearby, and how rich their lives were with experiences he had never shared. As the evening went on, the conversation shifted naturally from polite small talk to personal stories, memories, and reflections. The rancher felt a sense of connection that was entirely new to him. He realized that loneliness was not only about the absence of people, but about the absence of understanding and trust. Sitting across from this neighbor, sharing food and stories, he felt that absence begin to fade. At one point, the neighbor paused, looking thoughtfully at the rancher. "It is not often," he said slowly, "that someone reaches out like this. It takes courage to invite another person into your life, even for a single evening." The rancher felt a warmth in his chest, a mixture of pride and humility. He had expected hesitation or doubt, but instead he found acknowledgement and respect. The words were simple, but they carried weight far beyond the moment. The rancher smiled, a little awkwardly, and admitted, "I suppose I have grown tired of the quiet. I have had much in life, but not enough people to share it with. I did not want another night to pass without trying something different." The neighbor nodded, understanding without needing more explanation. There was no judgment, no criticism, only a shared recognition of the human need for companionship. As the meal ended, the rancher offered coffee and a few small desserts he had prepared. They sat by the fire, the flames casting a warm glow across the room, and continued to talk. The conversation moved naturally, from memories of childhood to stories about the land, from reflections on work to hopes for the future. The rancher found himself laughing quietly at a few of the neighbors' anecdotes, feeling a sense of ease he had not experienced in years. Time seemed to pass differently that night. Hours slipped by almost unnoticed as the two men shared stories, ideas, and thoughts. The rancher realized how much he had missed this, the simple joy of connection, of someone listening, of someone responding with genuine interest and understanding. He began to see that friendship was not built in grand gestures or elaborate plans, but in quiet, consistent moments of presence and attention. At one point, the neighbor shared a story about his youth, about learning to work the land with his family, and about the small lessons that shaped his character. The rancher listened, captivated by the simplicity and wisdom in the tale. He realized that he, too, had lessons learned from a life spent in solitude, from the quiet observation of the land and animals. It was a revelation. Each of them had knowledge and experiences that could enrich the other's life, if only they were willing to share. The rancher also noticed the small ways the neighbor respected the space he was in. He did not judge the house, the furniture, or the way the rancher lived. Instead, he seemed to absorb everything with quiet curiosity, offering appreciation where it was due, and staying attentive without needing to dominate the conversation. The rancher felt a growing sense of respect for the man who sat across from him, realizing that trust was being built not just in words, but in actions and attentiveness. As the night deepened, the rancher felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense that something meaningful had begun. He realized that he had stepped out of his comfort zone, that he had acted despite the uncertainty, and that the result was more rewarding than he had imagined. It was not just about having a guest for dinner. It was about bridging the gap between isolation and companionship, about allowing someone into his life in a way that felt sincere and genuine. Finally, the neighbor stood to leave, and the rancher felt a pang of reluctance. The evening had been brief in the span of a lifetime, yet it had brought a warmth that would linger for days to come. The neighbor thanked him for the meal and for the invitation, and the rancher felt gratitude swell within him, not only for the acknowledgement but for the experience itself. They shook hands, a firm and respectful gesture, and the neighbor promised to return. As the rancher watched him ride back to his own property under the soft glow of the moon, he felt a profound sense of hope. The night had shown him that reaching out was worth the risk, that connection could be found even after years of solitude. He returned to his house, sat by the fire, and allowed himself to reflect on the evening. For the first time in a long while, he felt that he was not entirely alone, that someone in the world understood, listened, and valued his presence. He realized that the journey toward friendship, trust, and understanding often begins with a single step, a small act of courage. He had taken that step tonight, and the reward was not only in the company of his neighbor, but in the opening of his own heart, the breaking of the walls he had built around himself. He felt lighter, more at peace, and more ready to embrace the possibilities that tomorrow might bring. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows across the room, and the rancher finally allowed himself to sleep with a quiet smile on his face. The evening had been a beginning, a spark of connection that promised more to come. And in that moment, he understood that loneliness could be softened, even overcome, by the courage to reach out and the willingness to accept another person into one's life. It was the first night of many, he hoped, in a friendship that would grow slowly but surely, rooted in respect, trust, and the shared experiences of two men who had found each other when they needed it most. And with that thought, he closed his eyes, feeling for the first time in years that he was not truly alone. After that first evening, the rancher and his Apache neighbor found themselves thinking about each other more than they expected. The simple act of sharing a meal had opened a door neither man had anticipated. For the rancher, it was a revelation. He realized how much he had missed having someone to truly talk to, someone who could listen without judgment and offer wisdom without arrogance. The neighbor, too, found himself appreciating the quiet honesty of the rancher, recognizing a man who, despite his wealth and success, carried a vulnerability that was rare and refreshing. A few days later, the rancher decided to invite the neighbor over again. This time the meal was even simpler: bread, fresh fruit, and a stew of vegetables and meat he had carefully prepared. But it was not about the food. It was about the company, about creating a space where conversation could flow naturally. As the neighbor arrived, the rancher noticed a subtle change in himself. He was no longer nervous in the same way. He felt anticipation, excitement, and a quiet pride for taking the first step toward connection. They sat at the table, and the conversation began with small talk, as always. They spoke about the weather, the state of the ranch, and the routines of daily life. But soon, the conversation began to dig deeper. The neighbor shared a story about his father, who had taught him the importance of patience and observation in all things, from tending the land to managing relationships. The rancher listened intently, fascinated by the perspective. It was different from his own upbringing, yet the values resonated deeply with him: hard work, respect, and thoughtfulness. The rancher found himself opening up in ways he had never done before. He spoke about his childhood, growing up in a family that valued success over emotion, and how that shaped his way of seeing the world. He shared his fears, his regrets, and his longing for connection. The neighbor listened without interruption, offering small nods and quiet acknowledgments that made the rancher feel heard. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, simply by being able to speak honestly and have someone truly understand. As the evening progressed, they moved from personal stories to shared interests. The rancher spoke about the ranch, the challenges of caring for so much land and so many animals, and the moments of quiet joy he found in watching the sunrise over the fields. The neighbor shared similar experiences from his own property, detailing the rhythm of life that came with working closely with the land. They laughed together at small frustrations, like stubborn fences that refused to stay upright or cattle that refused to cooperate, finding humor in the trials they each faced daily. There was also a moment of tension, a natural part of building trust. The neighbor mentioned the occasional misunderstandings between their communities, the times when pride or assumptions caused friction. The rancher admitted he had felt similar frustrations and recognized that fear of the unknown often fueled distrust. But instead of lingering on grievances, they discussed how to move forward, how to build understanding, and how to let the past remain in the past. This conversation, though serious, strengthened their bond. It showed that they could face differences honestly and respectfully, without letting them overshadow the potential for friendship. After the meal, they moved to the porch, where the night air was cool and the stars stretched endlessly overhead. The rancher offered the neighbor a drink, and they sat quietly, listening to the sounds of the ranch, the soft rustle of the trees, the distant calls of nocturnal animals, and the gentle breeze over the fields. It was a peaceful silence, but not an empty one. There was a sense of connection, a shared understanding that words could not fully capture. The rancher felt a calm he had not experienced in years, a sense that he was finally finding companionship that was genuine and lasting. The neighbor, too, reflected on the evening. He appreciated the rancher's willingness to be vulnerable, to share his life without pretension. He admired the effort and thoughtfulness put into the meal and the hospitality. But more than that, he valued the honesty of their interactions, the way they could speak openly without fear of judgment. In a world that often demanded caution and reserve, this evening felt like a rare gift, a space where both men could be themselves fully. They began to talk about hopes and dreams, not in a grand or ambitious way, but in the simple, meaningful sense of what they wanted for their lives. The rancher admitted he hoped to find someone to share his days with, someone who could understand the rhythm of ranch life and appreciate its quiet beauty. The neighbor spoke of wanting to strengthen the bonds within his family, to pass on lessons of patience, respect, and care for the land. These conversations deepened their understanding of each other, revealing values and desires that created a strong foundation for friendship. There were moments of laughter as well. The rancher shared stories of clumsy moments on the ranch, the time a calf had managed to escape a pen, or when he had accidentally locked himself out of the barn. The neighbor laughed heartily at these anecdotes, sharing similar experiences from his own life. Laughter became a bridge, a way to bond over the shared challenges and unexpected humor of everyday life. It reminded both men that even amidst hard work and responsibility, joy could always be found in small moments. As the night grew later, the rancher and the neighbor moved inside again, settling by the fire. The flames danced and flickered, casting warm light on their faces. Conversation turned to reflection, to lessons learned from the past, and to the importance of building meaningful relationships. The rancher realized that true connection required patience and trust, and that it could not be rushed or forced. The neighbor agreed, noting that understanding takes time and that every step toward friendship mattered. They also began to discuss plans for the future, not just in terms of the ranch or work, but in terms of continuing their growing friendship. The rancher suggested simple activities they could do together, helping each other with chores, sharing meals, or taking walks across the property. The neighbor welcomed the ideas, adding a few of his own, such as sharing knowledge about traditional land care and teaching some skills he had learned from his family. These plans were modest, but they were meaningful. They represented a commitment to continue building trust and connection over time. By the end of the evening, both men felt a sense of satisfaction and hope. The rancher, once weighed down by loneliness, felt lighter and more optimistic about the days to come. He had discovered that sharing his life, even in small ways, could bring immense joy and relief. The neighbor, too, felt gratitude for the opportunity to connect with someone outside his usual circles, someone willing to listen, learn, and appreciate his perspective. As the neighbor prepared to leave, they shook hands again, a gesture that had grown warmer and more familiar since the first evening. The rancher walked him to his horse, feeling a sense of anticipation for the next meeting. The neighbor smiled and nodded, acknowledging not only the evening they had shared, but also the promise of many more to come. It was a silent understanding that this friendship, born from courage and openness, had begun to take root and would continue to grow with time. The rancher returned to his home, closing the door behind him, and sat by the fire for a few moments, reflecting on the evening. He realized that friendship was not about grand gestures or extravagant events, but about the willingness to be present, to listen, and to care. He thought about the small details, the way his neighbor had listened, the quiet laughter, the shared understanding, and felt a deep sense of contentment. For the first time in a long while, he felt that he had found someone who could be a true companion in life. Sleep came easier that night, not because the day had been extraordinary, but because he felt connected. He had taken the risk of opening his life to another person, and the reward was greater than he had imagined. He understood that loneliness, while powerful, could be softened by courage and by genuine human connection. And as he drifted to sleep, he carried with him the quiet knowledge that this was only the beginning, that the evenings ahead would bring more laughter, more stories, and a deeper bond that neither man had anticipated but both would cherish. The next morning, he woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The work on the ranch remained demanding, but it no longer felt isolating. He looked forward to seeing his neighbor again, to sharing more experiences, and to learning from someone who offered insight, perspective, and friendship. The simple act of inviting someone into his home had transformed his perspective, showing him that the world was not as lonely as he had feared. Connection could be found in honesty, respect, and the courage to reach out. And so life continued on the ranch, but with a subtle, powerful change. The rancher began to notice small moments of joy in his daily routine, the sound of the wind, the soft lowing of the cattle, and the thought that soon he would share another meal, another conversation, another evening of laughter and understanding with his neighbor. The loneliness that had once weighed so heavily now felt lighter, softened by the presence of someone who cared, someone who could see beyond wealth and status to the heart of who he truly was. The friendship was still young, fragile even, but it carried a promise that was stronger than any fear or hesitation. Both men had taken a step into the unknown, and in doing so, they had discovered a rare and valuable treasure, the simple, enduring power of human connection. And as the rancher looked across the fields, he could not help but feel gratitude, not just for the neighbor, but for the courage that had allowed him to open his life and heart, paving the way for something truly meaningful to grow. Over the following weeks, the rancher and his Apache neighbor spent more time together. Their friendship, which had begun with a simple dinner, started to grow deeper. They found ways to meet often, sometimes over a meal, sometimes while working on their respective properties, and sometimes just sitting outside, sharing the quiet of the land and the warmth of conversation. Each meeting brought new stories, small lessons, and laughter. The rancher realized that these moments were gradually filling the emptiness he had lived with for so long. One morning, the rancher invited his neighbor to help with a repair on the barn roof. It was a large, old structure that had withstood many storms but needed care. The neighbor agreed, offering his experience and insight, and together they worked, moving carefully along the wooden beams. The physical labor, the shared responsibility, and the quiet communication without constant talking brought them closer. They learned each other's strengths, how the rancher was careful and meticulous, and how the neighbor could solve problems quickly and efficiently without fuss. While working, they shared stories of their childhoods. The rancher spoke of growing up on a smaller property, learning responsibility early, and feeling the pressure to succeed. The neighbor shared tales of his family, how elders taught respect for the land, patience in work, and the importance of family bonds. The rancher listened with fascination, realizing how much wisdom lay in the neighbor's experiences. He admired the quiet strength the neighbor carried, a strength that came not from wealth or power, but from understanding and experience. Their friendship was not without challenges. Some neighboring ranchers began to gossip about the unusual closeness between them. People whispered, asking why a wealthy rancher would spend time with someone from a different background, questioning motives that were never anything but sincere. The rancher noticed the glances, the subtle comments, and the judgment, and at first he felt the old sting of isolation returning. The neighbor, too, sensed the tension in the community, though he remained calm and focused on the friendship rather than the opinions around them. One afternoon, as they repaired a fence line dividing their properties, the rancher voiced his concern. "Some people seem surprised, even suspicious of us," he said quietly. "Do you think they'll ever understand why we're friends?" The neighbor paused, then spoke with gentle confidence. "People often fear what they do not understand, but that does not change what is right or true. Our friendship is ours, built on trust and respect. Others may never understand it fully, but that does not matter." The rancher nodded, feeling a sense of reassurance in those words. It was a lesson in patience and in remaining steadfast even when others doubted. The weeks passed, and the two men shared more than just work. They began to exchange knowledge about the land. The rancher learned traditional methods for caring for soil, managing water, and predicting weather changes. The neighbor, in turn, admired the rancher's modern techniques and organizational skills, and they often discussed ways to combine the best of both worlds. These exchanges deepened their respect for each other's expertise. They were not only friends but collaborators, learning and growing together in ways neither had expected. The rancher noticed changes within himself. He was more patient, more thoughtful, and more willing to see situations from different perspectives. He began to approach the ranch with a renewed sense of purpose, not just as a businessman, but as someone who could balance responsibility with compassion. He also noticed that the small things mattered more: sharing a meal, listening to a story, or helping a neighbor without expecting anything in return. His life felt richer, fuller, and more meaningful than it had in years. Yet, despite the growing closeness, challenges arose that tested their friendship. One day, a misunderstanding occurred when a few of the rancher's workers assumed the neighbor was interfering in ways he had not been. A task had been miscommunicated, and the neighbor's intentions were questioned by others. The rancher felt torn between defending his friend and managing the concerns of his employees. It was a delicate situation, one that required honesty, patience, and careful words. The rancher called the neighbor aside, explaining the situation and apologizing for the misunderstanding. The neighbor, however, responded calmly and without resentment. "Do not worry," he said. "People will always misunderstand. Our actions speak louder than words. Let us focus on what we know is true." The rancher felt gratitude for the neighbor's wisdom. It reminded him that true friendship was not about avoiding conflict, but about navigating it together with respect and understanding. Over time, small incidents like these strengthened their bond. Each challenge they faced together, whether a miscommunication, a skeptical comment from the community, or a tough day on the ranch, became an opportunity to trust each other more deeply. They learned to rely on one another not just for practical help, but for support, advice, and reassurance. The rancher discovered that friendship required courage, patience, and the willingness to stand by someone even when others doubted. The two men also shared moments of humor, which helped lighten the weight of their responsibilities. They laughed at mistakes made while working, funny memories from their past, or simple misunderstandings that occurred during daily life. These moments reminded them that friendship was not only about serious conversations and shared labor, but also about joy, playfulness, and the ability to enjoy each other's company. One evening, after a long day repairing a section of the fence and tending to the cattle, they sat by the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was painted with brilliant shades of orange and pink, and the rancher felt a deep sense of peace. He realized how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. The loneliness that had once felt unbearable had been replaced, slowly but surely, by connection, understanding, and companionship. He felt gratitude for the neighbor's presence, but also pride in himself for taking the first step that had made all this possible. The neighbor noticed the rancher's thoughtful silence and spoke softly. "You have changed," he said. "You seem lighter, more open to the world around you." The rancher smiled, realizing it was true. He had grown in ways he had not anticipated, not just in his ability to trust someone, but in his capacity to see life more fully, to appreciate small moments, and to value relationships over solitude. "And you," the rancher replied, "have taught me patience and perspective. I am grateful for your friendship." As the days turned into weeks, their friendship became a quiet force in both of their lives. The rancher found himself looking forward to each meeting, each conversation, and each shared task. He learned to value collaboration, to listen more deeply, and to trust in someone outside his immediate family or social circle. The neighbor, in turn, appreciated the rancher's openness, his willingness to learn, and his sincerity. They both recognized that friendships like theirs were rare and precious, built on mutual respect, honesty, and care. However, life on the ranch continued to bring challenges. One evening, a sudden storm rolled in, with strong winds and heavy rain. The rancher was worried about the cattle, the fences, and the barns. The neighbor quickly offered his help, and together they worked through the night to secure the animals, repair any damage, and ensure the property was safe. It was a long and exhausting night, but it revealed the depth of their trust and reliance on one another. In moments of crisis, they realized true friendship showed itself not just in words, but in action. After the storm passed, the rancher and the neighbor sat together, drenched but content, reflecting on the night's work. They laughed quietly at the challenges they had faced, feeling a sense of accomplishment and camaraderie. The rancher understood that life would always have difficulties, but facing them with a trusted friend made even the hardest tasks manageable. The neighbor nodded in agreement, recognizing that shared effort, respect, and understanding created bonds that could withstand anything. Their friendship continued to grow, strengthened by shared experiences, mutual respect, and the willingness to face challenges together. The rancher discovered that solitude could be replaced not just by the presence of another person, but by genuine trust and companionship. The neighbor learned that even someone with wealth and status could offer sincerity, humility, and a willingness to learn. Together, they built a partnership grounded in humanity, kindness, and loyalty. As the weeks and months passed, the rancher and his neighbor became a quiet example in their community. People noticed their growing bond, the way they respected and supported each other. Though some continued to gossip or misunderstand, the friendship itself remained strong, unwavering, and inspiring. The rancher realized that true friendship required courage, patience, and openness, and that the rewards, trust, understanding, and companionship were far greater than he had ever imagined. The rancher often reflected on how much his life had changed. From the depths of loneliness, he had found connection, trust, and joy. He had learned that friendship was not something that could be rushed or forced. It had to be nurtured, cared for, and respected. And as he looked across the fields, knowing that the neighbor was nearby, ready to share work, stories, or a simple evening together, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. Life, he realized, was richer when shared. One afternoon, just as the rancher and his neighbor were finishing a day of work on the property, dark clouds began to gather over the horizon. The wind picked up, rustling the trees and bending the tall grass across the fields. Both men paused and looked at each other, knowing that the weather could turn dangerous quickly. Living on the ranch meant understanding the unpredictability of nature, but even with experience, storms could be frightening and destructive. The rancher immediately thought of the cattle grazing in the open fields, the barns, and the fences they had worked so hard to repair. Without hesitation, he turned to his neighbor. "We need to secure everything before it gets worse," he said. The neighbor nodded, calm and composed but ready for action. They moved quickly, checking the pens and rounding up cattle, ensuring that each animal was safe and accounted for. The wind grew stronger, and the first drops of rain began to fall, but they worked steadily together, relying on years of knowledge and experience to guide them. As the storm intensified, it became clear that it would be a difficult night. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the ranch in bright, brief bursts, and thunder rolled in the distance. The rancher felt his heart pound, but the presence of his neighbor at his side gave him confidence. They worked in silence at first, communicating with gestures and brief words, trusting each other's instincts. Every decision, from securing gates to reinforcing the barn doors, required teamwork and quick thinking. It was a test of their skills, endurance, and trust in one another. At one point, a strong gust of wind knocked over a section of fence, and some of the cattle broke free. The rancher felt panic rising, but the neighbor acted quickly, guiding the animals back with calm authority. The rancher joined in, and together they managed to corral the herd, speaking quietly and giving clear commands. The moment was tense, but it highlighted the strength of their friendship. In danger, they relied not only on experience, but on the trust and understanding they had built over weeks of shared time. After several hours of relentless work, they managed to secure the ranch. They were soaked from head to toe, exhausted from the physical effort, but there was a sense of satisfaction in the air. The storm continued outside, but inside the barn, the rancher and his neighbor could finally breathe. They leaned against the stable walls, catching their breath and exchanging a quiet glance that spoke volumes. Words were unnecessary. Their actions had proven the depth of their trust and the strength of their bond. When the storm began to subside, they moved back to the ranch house, dripping wet but feeling a quiet pride. The fire had long since gone out in the fireplace, and they worked together to relight it, filling the room with warmth and light. They cleaned themselves up as best they could, and the rancher prepared a simple meal, hot soup and fresh bread, to restore energy after the exhausting night. The neighbor helped, not just with practical tasks, but by offering steady support and encouragement. As they sat by the fire, eating quietly, the rancher felt a deep sense of gratitude. He realized that this night, which had begun with fear and uncertainty, had transformed into a testament of their friendship. They had faced a true test, and together they had succeeded. The neighbor, too, reflected on the night's events. He understood that friendship was not only about shared laughter and stories, but also about standing together in times of difficulty, supporting one another through challenges, and trusting each other completely. The conversation turned reflective. The rancher spoke about the moments earlier in life when he had felt most alone, and how the presence of his neighbor had changed everything. "I thought I would live my life surrounded by land and cattle, yet still be empty," he said quietly. "But you've shown me that connection is what makes life meaningful. You've taught me that sharing the burden, the joys, and the quiet moments is far more important than any wealth or success." The neighbor nodded, understanding completely. "And you have shown me that friendship can cross boundaries, that sincerity and respect create bonds that last. We are stronger together than apart." They spoke long into the night, sharing memories, hopes, and even fears. The rancher admitted that he had learned humility, patience, and the importance of trust through their friendship. The neighbor spoke about the value of companionship, the joy of being understood, and the strength that comes from facing challenges alongside someone you trust. The conversation was honest, heartfelt, and filled with quiet laughter, even amidst exhaustion. They both realized that what they shared was rare and precious, a friendship forged through courage, respect, and shared experience. In the days that followed, the storm became a story they told often. Friends and neighbors who had once questioned their bond began to notice the respect, understanding, and support between the two men. The rancher and his neighbor continued their routine, but now with a new depth. They worked together, shared meals, and exchanged knowledge about the land, while also enjoying quiet moments simply being in each other's presence. Their friendship became a source of stability, joy, and inspiration for both of them. The rancher often reflected on how much his life had changed in such a short time. The loneliness that had once felt unbearable had been replaced by connection, trust, and shared purpose. He had learned that courage to reach out to someone, even in a small way, could transform life in ways he had never imagined. The neighbor, too, realized the power of openness and trust. He had discovered that even in a world filled with differences, common ground could be found, and meaningful friendships could flourish when respect and sincerity were present. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky with brilliant colors, the rancher and his neighbor sat on the porch, sharing a quiet moment. They watched the cattle graze peacefully, the wind gently rustling the trees, and the soft glow of the fields in the fading light. The rancher felt a sense of peace that he had not known in years. He understood that true friendship was not only about shared laughter and stories, but also about being present, supportive, and honest with each other in all circumstances. The neighbor spoke quietly, his voice thoughtful. "I have seen many things in my life, but this friendship, it is rare. It is built on honesty, respect, and shared experience. You have shown me the value of connection in a way that will stay with me always." The rancher felt a lump in his throat, overwhelmed with gratitude. "And you have taught me humility, patience, and courage. I am no longer alone, and I feel whole in a way I never expected." From that day forward, their friendship became a permanent part of their lives. They continued to meet regularly, sharing work, meals, and conversations, but also celebrating small victories, teaching each other new skills, and supporting each other through personal challenges. Their bond inspired others in the community, showing that trust, respect, and genuine care could overcome prejudice, misunderstanding, and distance. The rancher often thought back to the night when he had first invited his neighbor into his home. It seemed like a simple gesture at the time, but it had changed his life in ways he could never have anticipated. He realized that the decision to reach out, to open his heart, and to offer genuine companionship had been the most important choice he had ever made. The neighbor had not only become a trusted friend, but had brought wisdom, joy, and a sense of belonging into his life. Over time, the two men continued to grow together, learning from each other, supporting each other, and sharing the quiet beauty of life on the land. Their friendship was a living example of the power of human connection, the ability of kindness, courage, and respect to transform loneliness into companionship, fear into trust, and distance into closeness. They had built something rare, enduring, and deeply meaningful, proving that true friendship could be found even in the most unexpected circumstances. And so, the rancher, once weighed down by loneliness, found a companion in his Apache neighbor. They faced storms, challenges, and misunderstandings, yet each obstacle only strengthened their bond. They discovered that friendship is not built on wealth, status, or appearances, but on honesty, trust, and shared humanity. Together, they created a life that was fuller, richer, and far more meaningful than either could have imagined alone. As the years passed, the two men continued to meet, laugh, work, and share stories. They celebrated successes, comforted each other in difficult times, and enjoyed the quiet moments that spoke more than words ever could. Their friendship, born of courage and openness, became a lasting testament to the power of human connection. The rancher no longer felt the weight of loneliness, and the neighbor felt the joy of a friendship that transcended boundaries and expectations. At the end of each day, as they watched the sun dip below the horizon and the stars begin to appear, they shared a silent understanding. They knew that their friendship had changed both of their lives forever. It had brought hope, joy, and companionship where there had once been only isolation. It had taught them the value of trust, patience, and courage. And most importantly, it had shown that even in a world filled with challenges, friendship, respect, and kindness could create something truly extraordinary. The rancher smiled quietly as he looked across the fields, knowing that he was no longer alone. His life, once filled with solitude, was now enriched with the presence of someone who had become family, teacher, and companion all at once. The neighbor, standing beside him, returned the smile, sharing the quiet satisfaction of knowing that their bond would endure, a living proof that true connection is worth every risk, every effort, and every step taken to reach out and welcome another person into your life.